Hello, students, and welcome back to San Diego. This is going to be the longer, uncut version of my non-Mendelian video. This is a long topic, so might be like a 20-minute video, but that's okay. This is a fascinating topic, and I hope you're as excited for me to learn a little bit more about the genetics behind what makes you you. So let's jump right in. Here is how to share my whole desktop. So here's everything we're going to talk about today. I'll probably cut the video at some point to get to the meat of it. But for those of you who are tuning in for this uncut video, you get to see some of the reasoning behind it. So every year, College Board sends out these unit guides to their teachers to try to help us to help you know what you need to know for the test. So let's see what is the actual essential knowledge you need to know for the test. And as I already mentioned, this is one of the longer sections. Most of the things, have like one paragraph of knowledge or three little sentences of things you want to know. This topic has 1, 2, 3, 4 things to know, and then subpoints within each thing. So quite a lot of information in this topic, but I'll do my best to help digest some of it for you, tell you what you need to know, tell you what information is in the textbook, and try to synthesize it all together in a helpful way. So let's jump right in. Oh, actually, before we do that, I will say, check out the garden of my parents' garden in San Diego. Very green. There's been a lot of rain, so we've been enjoying, the garden has really been enjoying the rain. I hope you enjoy that. There's a previous video where I do a walking tour of the garden. So I also mentioned, like I did another video on this. I saw 3 of you watch that video. I hope you enjoyed it, but there was problems with the video. I didn't share my screen correctly, so I'm gonna have to redo it. That's okay. I did cover all the topics I wanted to anyway, so this is Unit 5, Topic 4, Non-Mendelian Genetic, Take 2, Uncut version. But I got my coffee, I'm ready to go. Okay, so last time we talked about Mendelian genetics, things were simple. We were studying pea plants with Mendel back in the 1800s. But you, I don't know if you knew this, are not a pea plant. Shocking. So why did I emphasize in the last video that it was really important that Mendel studied pea plants and not even mice? Well, that's because Mendelian genetics, his assumptions that allowed him to really understand Mendelian genetics without knowing anything about DNA, which was really impressive, fall apart and when we really start talking about many human traits. Non-Mendelian genetics is just human genetics in most cases. Most human traits are non-Mendelian. There's a few ones that we like to say are kind of Mendelian. I've heard textbook talk about earlobes being attached or not as being a non-Mendelian trait. I don't know if I believe that, but it certainly shows some Mendelian ratios and such. And one of the reasons why we don't really think that most human traits are Mendelian is the simplest one is that most human traits are polygenetic traits. That's what this paragraph says right here. And that's the first thing that you should know, is that most human traits are polygenetic traits. Let's figure out what that means real quick. So this is how the AP wants you to know it. They say many traits are the product of multiple genes and/or physiological processes acting in combination. These traits, therefore, do not segregate in Mendelian patterns. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is actually really interesting. In polygenic inheritance or polygenic traits, what happens is we don't just have tall people and short people. We don't just have people with blue eyes and brown eyes. We have a broad range of human traits. Why is that? Well, it's because it's not one tall gene. That if you have it, you're tall, and if you don't, you're short. No, there's a variety. There's many genes working in concert that helps determine type, your how tall you are. There's many genes working in concert that affect the color of your eyes. There's many genes working in concert that affect your hair color, your beard color, if you have a beard, everything else. So what's going on in human inheritance? The physical traits that you see for those around you are really polygenic. They're determined not just by one gene, but by many genes. And so they're not going to follow this simple Mendelian traits that we've been talking about. Another thing that is mentioned is there's also physiological processes acting on it. This is important because you can have two identical twins, one of which has a genetic disease and the other doesn't. Well, that's strange. I thought you said that the genes are what determines the proteins that are made, that are what determines what makes you biologically, Mr. Rickert. What's going on? Well, actually, there's a whole study, a whole field called epigenetics, and where we see what are some other processes. Maybe one of the twins get exposed to an environmental toxin, or there's another physiological epigenetic process going on that causes that genetic disease to be expressed in one of the two identical twins and not in the other. That's one of the cutting edge. That's on the cutting edge of our study of genetics, epigenetics. So as we see that when we get into the details of real human traits, we can no longer just assume that it's going to be one gene, one trait. We can no longer just assume that things are going to be simply dominant or recessive. And there's 7 key variations from classical Mendelian genetics presented in your book that you should know. Let me just note, again, going to the unit guide, we're going to get to that, but going to the unit guide, what are the most essential ones you need to know for the AP test? Fortunately, they're keeping it simple. This is an introductory AP bio class. We're covering a lot in a short amount of time, and so we can't go into this as detailed as you will if you take a course in biology. So let's just let you know really quick, what's the essential knowledge before we talk about all 7. So the first thing you need to know is that Mendel's laws don't always apply. Done. That's understandable. Second thing we want to know, so that's what they say. That's because and let me, we'll talk about that at the start of the next video. Okay, so, and then some traits are sex chromosomes. So we can have sex-linked traits. We'll talk about that later in the video. We already talked about polygenic inheritance, multiple genes acting in combination. And the last thing that you should really know is that some traits result from non-nuclear inheritance. So there's, as you remember, the mitochondria has its own DNA. That DNA gets passed on completely and completely by the egg and not by the sperm. And in plants, both the mitochondria and the chloroplast are transmitted in the ovule and not in the pollen. So we see that most traits we get from both parents, some traits, and we won't talk about this anymore in the video. But it's something we've talked about in previous videos, and we want to. That's something to remember, is that some inheritance only happens, specifically the mitochondria and chloroplast, because they're organelles. They are only found in the egg. Remember, the sperm really only gives. It doesn't give any of the organelles or anything other than the chromosomal information. And so because the mitochondria and chloroplast are in the, let me restart. Sorry about that. Sometimes you just need to take a breath, collect your thoughts. Okay, so what I was trying to say was we need to remember that when the egg and sperm come together, the egg is a much larger cell, and all of the organelles come from the egg, whether it's a human egg or also, if we're talking about plants, the ovule. So all of the organelles come from that. The sperm goes into the egg and it joins, and it really only provides information for the nucleus. And those form that, then those haploids form into the diploids that then provide the genetic information for the rest of the cell. So in terms of mitochondria, in terms of chloroplast, because they have their own DNA, that's only going to be passed on maternally. And in college, we got to do some pretty interesting mitochondrial genetical tests where we found out, where our mother's line was from. That's kind of fun lab to do. Okay, so we won't talk about that today. Store that in the back of your mind. We've talked about that. We should already know that, but throw them back in mind. So the main thing we're going to talk about here is polygenic inheritance and sex-linked traits. And I think this is a good time to cut the video. So I'm going to cut the video right here. Welcome back. Today we're talking about the details of polygenic inheritance. There's 7 exceptions that are talked about in your book, and I'll tell you which of these are emphasized on the AP test and what each of these terms mean. So welcome back, and let's jump into our new topic. Oh, sorry, I moved it around. Okay, so our variations from classical Mendelian genetics. What is non-Mendelian genetics? Well, Mendelian genetics still provides us with the terminology and the things that we need to know in general. They help us understand, and Mendel coined the term dominant trait, non-dominant trait, and he helped us understand how things are passed on. But there's important exceptions to this. And it turns out most human traits have the number 6, a very important exception, polygenic inheritance. And in fact, of all of these variations from classical Mendelian genetics, this is the one that AP test really focuses on. They want you to know is that in real life, many traits are not controlled by one gene. This is called polygenic inheritance. This happens in humans when we look at something such as height. So there's not just one tall gene and one short gene. Most of you are not the exact height of one of your parents, or even a blend of the two. In fact, height has to do with many factors. And there's many genes on multiple chromosomes. So because of that, we have a broad range of phenotypes or physical characteristics when it comes to height. And in fact, anytime, let's see if I could find this, yeah. Anytime that we have a whole range of possibilities in phenotype, that's because of polygenic inheritance. So whether it's skin color, which is the example emphasized in your book, whether it's height, or any other trait where we see many different genes being involved, we have polygenic inheritance. Even something that seems simple, like eye color. Sometimes people say, oh, people either have brown eyes or colored eyes. That's kind of a strange statement. Of course, if you actually spend any time at all looking at people's eyes, you know that that's also polygenic. There's many shades of brown eyes, and there's many different colors of eyes. And so anytime that we have a lot of different genes involved in a trait, we're going to see a broad range of phenotype, physical characteristics, because of the result of polygenic inheritance. Definitely something you want to know for the AP exam. A couple other important examples that we'll talk about at the time that may or may not be on the AP exam are 1 through 5. So we'll talk about these quickly. Sometimes they're on the AP exam, often they're not, but they're good to know. We might have a few multiple choice type questions on your unit test on each of these. So number 1, incomplete dominance. Okay, so we talked about with Mendelian inheritance that the flowers of the pea plants were either red or white, and the red flowers dominated the white flowers. Well, that did happen in Mendel's pea plants, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you can get the pink case. So some flowers, you can actually get a blending of two traits. That's called incomplete dominance. And this happens sometimes also in human traits and other things where instead of having just a purely dominant and recessive trait, we can actually have a blending taking place in the homozygous case. This actually happens in some genetic diseases as well, where we can kind of act like the genetic disease is Mendelian, but in reality, there's actually three cases. There's the case of the completely healthy individual, who is often homozygous dominant for this disease. There's the heterozygous case. We call that person a carrier. And then there's the person who has the disease fully, and that person is homozygous recessive. And in that heterozygous case, sometimes that person has still functioning, but less functioning trait. For example, in sickle cell disease that's a recessive, that's a result of a recessive gene that affects the population. If someone's a carrier, they have different, their red blood cells are actually altered from the healthy case where they don't have that disease at all. And so that's an example of incomplete dominance. But the easiest example is to think of flowers. But I just wanted to show you that all of these examples go beyond the example case. Another example that your book talks about is having to do with cholesterol. And again, this is a common case in this in a lot of genetic diseases. We can have normal cells, we can have those people with mild disease, but the people who are really affected are those who get the disease genotype from both parents. This can often lead to fatal or extremely problematic disease cases. Okay, the next two ones we're talking about quickly is you can have cases of multiple alleles. And the famous example of this is blood types. Blood types is a fascinating thing to study. You will probably study it if you take any sort of biology classes in college. Unfortunately, we really don't have time to get into the biology multiple alleles, other than just to say that because there's 4 main blood types, there's really 8 main blood types. There's really hundreds of blood types, but there's 4 main blood types, A, B, AB, and O. We get some really interesting genetics of that. We'll talk about that in class. But for the AP exam, just know that it is possible to have more than 2 alleles in a population. That's similar to polygenic inheritance, but a little bit different, because in this case, you can be A type, B type, AB type, which is a type of codominant, or O type. So that's 3 different alleles. Codominant is like this AB blood, where both are dominant. This is also seen in flowers. So if we cross a white flower and a red flower, end up with a flower that has both white and red streaks, as shown here. Well, not there, but is shown in your book, then that's called codominance. And the last one you can know is that one gene can affect more than one phenotype. And there's many examples of this to know. But as far as the AP exam, we wouldn't ask you about this term. You should just know that another type of non-Mendelian genetic is if one gene affects multiple traits. That happens in human genetics as well. Okay, so those are all examples of non-Mendelian genetics. We're gonna finish by talking specifically about sex-linked traits and how they are passed on. So previously we talked about Punnett squares, and I said you can just use capital T, lowercase t. But one problem we have is when we know that not all traits are found on all chromosomes. And in fact, all non-Mendelian, Mendelian genetics is based off the assumption that, I didn't mean to close that. Mendelian genetics is based off of the assumption that these traits are independent. Remember, that was the key assumption that he made. That one trait does not cause the other trait to happen. And so that's why we have all these exceptions. In real life, that's not always the case. Sometimes the traits are right next to each other and they interact, or sometimes they're linked, or sometimes they're only found in the X or the Y chromosome. So let's talk about this last example, and this will illustrate how this works, how there can be exceptions to this. So what if we have a genetic disease that's only found on the Y chromosome? Interesting. That's called a sex-linked genetic disease. So let's talk about that. Sex-linked genetic disease. So let's actually say it's an X-linked. It's only found on the X chromosome, because that's a more interesting example. And this happens in real life. So what's going to happen? Does that mean only females are going to have it? No. No, remember, males also have X chromosomes. And so in fact, how this actually works is, let's look at two individuals and how they would pass out, doing kind of a modified Punnett square here. So the one parent, let's say the mother, could be a carrier for this disease. So we're gonna say X prime is diseased. The mother, of course, has two X chromosomes. The father has one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. If he has the disease, he's not a carrier, has the disease in his X chromosome, what will happen in the next generation? Well, if you remember from our previous video how to do Punnett squares, we can just do it out and see. We don't have to memorize anything. So this first offspring is going to be female, XX, and have the disease. Both of them have it. But does that mean all their daughters, if they have daughters who have the disease? No. Let's look at this next one. The next possible offspring will be a daughter that is a carrier for the disease, but doesn't have it. That's good. Remember, not all carriers are going to have the full disease. And they might only be mildly affected by the trait or not affected at all. And so it's a 50-50% chance in these X-linked in this genetic disease will be passed on to the next generation. 50% chance that it will be not passed on. What about the male offspring? Well, in the male offspring, the father is not passing on his X. He's always passing on his Y. So in this case, it doesn't matter what the father had at all. The only thing that's determining whether this offspring has the disease or not is which chromosome they got from the mom. And so the male offspring also ends up being 50-50. Pretty interesting. And we could do a similar Punnett square for other examples. What if the male parent is healthy and the female parent has the disease? We could do another Punnett square. I encourage you to do that one for yourself on your own. What you should find if you do a female parent for X-linked genetic disease that has the disease, and a male parent that does not have the disease or is healthy, what you'll find is that all of the male offspring will get the disease. Interesting. But the female offspring will be 50-50. Go ahead and do that Punnett square for yourself. Check it out. Yeah, and I think we'll pause there. So there was a lot. This has been a longer video, but I hope it was helpful. We talked about Mendel's laws, and we said that they don't always work out because real genetics is complicated, especially humans. We don't just have one tall gene and one short gene, or one gene that controls each of our physical traits. We have a variety of genes That's a good thing because it allows for polygenic inheritance. But it just makes studying this a little bit more interesting and complicated. Now, there are traits that are simpler, and often diseases come from one particular mutation on one gene. So how do we track those? Well, we need to know whether they're sex linked or not, whether they show incomplete dominance or complete dominance. And once we know if there's any exception to our Mendelian rules, then we can actually have a better understanding of how these diseases are passed on. We talked about the example of incomplete dominance in these processes. Okay, that's it for today. I hope that's helpful, and I'll hope you are all having a very restful break, and see you next time.